My name is Deb Van Dynen. I'm an Associate Professor of English Education at Hope College, and I have the honor of being the NEA Big Read and Little Read Lakeshore Director. The NEA Big Read Lakeshore and Little Read Lakeshore programs are month-long community-wide reading programs focused on the reading of a common book. This year, because of COVID, we've switched to a mostly virtual program. We're excited for the possibilities that this presents us as we can expand our audience's scope and reach, as well as our ability to connect with speakers and experts that are beyond our geographical reach. Thank you for joining us this year as we explore Nathaniel Philbrick's In the Heart of the Sea and Marcia Diane Arnold's Galapagos Girl Galapagos. We hope you enjoy these events and learn lots about the book's topics and themes, as well as issues and important questions in our world today.
My name is Nettie Manuel. I am the secretary for the board for the Alliance for Cultural and Ethnic Harmony. Every year we host a discussion like this during the Big Read. This is only my second since I've been on the board, and I loved last year, so I've been really looking forward to this. The Alliance, we have been working through all of this. This year we redid our logo, so it's nice and fresh with lots of just fresh, solid colors. When we're not all quarantining or staying socially distant, the Alliance really encourages people to get to know their neighbors and experience different cultures through your neighbors. We're really hoping to be able to get our events that we hold monthly. We try to do things monthly. We want to get those going again regularly. So we're working on that, and just anything where there's open dialogue and getting to know people, that is really our goal. So please find us at harmonyalliance.org and on Facebook. And Twitter. We are on Twitter now too.
Thanks, Nettie. Okay, Bill, it's all yours.
Okay, can you guys hear me all right?
Yes.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so we are in a classroom in Lubbers all together, and so we're unmasking when we speak, but then masking up again when we're done speaking. And the reason we're all together is because I am not real good at tech, and every kid around me is wonderful at it. So I knew if I crashed, they would save me. So that's really the main reason that we're all together in this classroom. And so far, it's looking like we're going to be okay. So good evening, folks. My name is Bill Moreau, and I'm a teacher in the English department, and I do some stuff for the education department too here at Hope. And I want to welcome you to this Big Read book discussion event, focusing on the book In the Heart of the Sea by Nathaniel Philbrick. Thanks for allowing us to visit you remotely at the Alliance for Cultural and Ethnic Harmony. Although I currently teach full-time at Hope, I started my work life as a secondary English teacher at Hamilton High School, where I finished a 36-year career in 2012. During the last 29 years of that time, I was a part-time teacher at Hope. This is now my 9th year of teaching here full-time since leaving Hamilton. And one of the great joys that I have is to work with students who are either English majors or English minors, and they want to become teachers. So it's just a wonderful thing. So tonight I have 5 such students from an English methods class that I teach for the English/education department. So eventually they will each introduce themselves, and they're going to share some background material on this Big Read book before we discuss it. And although this is the 3rd year we have had a Big Read Lakeshore book discussion with the ACEH. This is actually the 7th year that Hope College and the Big Read have teamed up. And some of you may remember the other Big Read book selections over that time span. We read To Kill a Mockingbird, and The Things They Carried, and Brother, I'm Dying, and When the Emperor Was Divine, and Station 11, and In the Time of the Butterflies, and now, of course, In the Heart of the Sea. So here's our plan. I'm going to give a brief bit of background about the Big Read. Then Hope student Morgan is going to share a presentation on the author and a little bit about the book. And then Ellie will talk about the whaling industry. Team Josh and Avery will speak on race relations in the text. And Caitlin will point out some themes or takeaways from the book. And then finally, we'll discuss the book as a group. And we plan on being done at about 9, so you can move on with your evening. And so I can put on my jammies and go to bed. This is really pushing it for me. You know the saying, nothing good happens after midnight. Well, for me, it's nothing good happens after 9 p.m. except sleeping. So you also have to bear with us. This whole tech piece is a bit delicate to navigate. My students are hoping to share their screens, and because Deb's in control, we can do that. When we were at Freedom Village on Wednesday, people couldn't join, so we just had to do a book discussion amongst ourselves, but already we've been able to talk with each other. So I think the tech is going to be perfect. Okay, so I need to share just a little bit of intro to the big read, and I really have to do that because Dr. Deb Van Dyne, my boss, is in the audience, so I got to make sure that I do this right. So the National Endowment for the Arts Big Read and the Big Read Lakeshore, our local version, broadens our understanding of our world, our communities, and ourselves to the joy of sharing a good book. Showcasing a diverse range of themes, voices, and perspectives, the NEA Big Read aims to inspire conversation and discovery. Studies show that reading for pleasure reduces stress, we all need some of that, heightens empathy, we all need some of that, improves students' test scores, slows the onset of dementia, and makes us more active and aware citizens. Book clubs and community reading programs extend these benefits by creating opportunities to explore together the issues that are relevant to our lives. Through the lens of American history and culture, the titles in the NEA Big Read Library for 2021 and 2022 present an array of voices, perspectives, time periods, and genres that can help us as a nation to reflect on where we've been, where we are today, and where we're going. And by the way, visiting that NEA Big Read website that has the list of the 30 to 35 books is a great thing to do. And those are the ones that we need to choose from. So we have another subcommittee that works real hard on trying to decide what's the next one to do, but that's a great reading list. One more paragraph. Since 2006, the National Endowment for the Arts has funded more than 1,600 Big Read programs, provided more than $22 million to organizations nationwide. In addition, NEA Big Read activities have reached every congressional district in the country, and over the past 14 years, grantees have leveraged more than $50 million in local funding to support their NEA Big Read programs. More than 5.7 million Americans have attended an NEA Big Read event. Approximately 91,000 volunteers, like us, have participated at a local level, and over 39,000 community organizations, like yours, have partnered to make the NEA Big Read activities possible. So that's the NEA Big Read in a nutshell. Thanks for listening to that. Okay, so now we're going to go to student presentations, and Morgan Raymond is going to share some background on the author and the book, and then we will move from there. I do have one question though before Morgan speaks, and that's just, can you raise your hand or give us a thumbs up if you have had the opportunity to read the book, so we know, just kind of surveying the audience. So folks who have done reading, my students have done all the reading too, so all right, okay, even though they're not raising their hands. Okay, Morgan, you got it. Yeah, that looks good, right?
Okay. So my name is Morgan. I'm a junior at Hope, and I'm an English and German secondary ed major. And I'm going to be sharing just a little bit of basic information about the book, what happens in the book, and just a little bit of background about the author. So first, about the author. The author is Nathaniel Philbrick. He got interested in maritime literature because his father was a professor. So this book has to do with the book Moby Dick, and that was one of his favorite books. He also is involved in sailboat racing. He actually moved to Nantucket with his family, so he has some real firsthand experience from the area. And he's also involved in the Maritime Institute there and research at the Nantucket Historical Association. And as seen in this book and other books he's written, he writes, so this story is like a nonfiction story, an actual historical event, but the stories he tends to write have a sort of like horror adventure aspect to them, like this book does. So in the heart of the sea, the book is set in Nantucket and has to do with the whaling industry. So in the On Nantucket, there's a big sort of whaling culture. This is set in the early 1800s, and most of the people there are Quakers. And the culture there has to deal with the men leaving on the whaling ships often for a few years at a time, while the women stayed home to take care of the families and businesses. So this is kind of the culture that was happening at the time of the book. And then I'm just going to give a couple of the basic idea about the plot, just to remind you in case it's been a little while since you've read the book, or if you have not read the book, it'll give you a little bit of an idea about what it's about. So the Essex whale ship left Nantucket in 1819, and I have listed here on the presentation the 20 crew members of the ship. So the captain was George Pollard. This was his first time as the captain, and then the first mate was Owen Chase, and then I have listed the second mate, cabin boy, and then the 3 boat steward and 13 sailors were either African Americans or off-islanders, so not from Nantucket, and that will play into the race relations part of it later. So after the Essex, they had been traveling around the ocean whale hunting. They had had some success whale hunting, but then on November 20th, 1820, an 85-foot whale rammed and sunk the Essex. So this is the well-known Essex disaster, the main event of the book. So the crew ends up divided into 3 different whale boats with whatever supplies they could salvage, and they decide to try to head for South America while they're stranded on the open sea. And then the main part of the book here is where the men are trying to survive on the open sea. And so they face starvation, dehydration, brutal weather, disease, loss of hope, and they had to go through some drastic measures to survive, which is a key point of this book that really makes us think, like, how would we act in that situation? It's like raw humanity that we don't usually have to deal with in our day-to-day lives. So after they have to figure out ways to cope with what they're going through that is really unimaginable for some of us. So eventually, some of them do die, some of them decide to stay back on an island and later get rescued, but after 89 days, Chase, Nickerson, and Lawrence are come across another ship, and they're rescued there and brought back to South America, and then Pollard and Ramsdell are also rescued a few days later at the end of the book. And the end of the book gives a little bit of detail about what happened to these few men that survived after they've gone home, and they really weren't looked at as heroes at all. They were more shamed for the like cannibalism and things like that they had to turn to while they were trying to survive. And so makes us think of like the perspective and what we think of like morals of people who have to go through those kinds of things, and then they'd kind of just live out the rest of their lives quietly, and this whole disaster is more or less forgotten about on Nantucket, and then so this book kind of helped bring it back to our attention.
Hi, everybody. My name is Tara. I'm a secondary English education major with a history minor here at Hope, and I'm going to talk a little bit about the whaling history on Nantucket. So at the beginning, as people started moving to Nantucket, they originally moved there to be farmers, but they quickly realized that because of how small the island was, they weren't going to have enough resources to support the industry of farming there. And so they looked to what was around them, the sea, for their money and their jobs eventually. So Nantucketers knew about whaling. Whaling wasn't a new thing that they had heard about. It was pretty common on the mainland, but it wasn't something that the islanders had ever dared try themselves. But they were in a good place to try it because they had right whales that would come to the south of the island every fall and stay until the spring. So eventually, a mainlander by the name of Ichabod Paddock came to Nantucket and taught the Nantucketers how to hunt right whales. And so as the whaling industry took off, a lot of Nantucketers were using the Wampanoag Indians to help them do the brunt work of this. And then eventually they just started creating crews of Nantucketers themselves and taking out bigger ships into the ocean. In 1712, Captain Hussey was on a typical whaling expedition for right whales when he got blown out into the sea. And there he encountered a sperm whale, which is a type of whale that we deal with in the heart of the sea. And he killed it and brought it back to Nantucket and realized that the blubber from sperm whales burned clearer and brighter than right whale blubber. And so this is when Nantucketers really started to focus on hunting sperm whales instead of the right whales. But by 1760, Nantucketers had already wiped out the local whale population and had to begin to sail further out to continue their industry. So they started sailing to places like the Arctic Circle, west of Africa, east of South America, and eventually in the Essex, we see that they're going around Cape Horn of South America to get to the Pacific. And by 1819, Nantucket was the whaling capital of the world. This is just a quote that I like from the book. So it says, "Long gone were the days when Nantucketers could watch from shore as the men and boys of the island pursued the whale. Nantucket was now the whaling capital of the world." And then these are just pictures of what a right whale looked like and what a sperm whale looked like. And like I said before, they started out hunting the right whales and then moved to sperm whales because the blubber they could sell for more because it was better quality. So the whaling industry on Nantucket really increased really fast and was high for a few decades, and then it plummeted really fast. So it was this big spike and then it went down super fast. And there were many reasons that it declined. One of those reasons was that the harbor in New Bedford became larger. It could hold larger ships than Nantucket did, and that was because Nantucket in the sea, they had something called the Nantucket Bar. And bigger ships had a really hard time getting over this bar. They would have to take little ships and unload the bigger ship so it could get over the bar and then load it back up. And that just took a lot of time and equipment. And then New Bedford was also a more populated harbor, so it was easier for whaling ships to sell their blubber than it was for them to sell it in Nantucket. Nantucketers also refused to change their hunting grounds. So by the time their hunting grounds were depleted, they weren't going out to find other places to hunt, which really hurt their industry as a whole. And Quakerism also began to fracture on the island, and it was a very foundational part of their community. And so as it continued to fall apart and people began to focus their lives on other things outside of whaling, that really hurt the whaling industry as well. And then there was a big event in July of 1846 that really hurt the whaling industry on Nantucket. So a fire started in the local hat factory on Nantucket, and because it was one of the driest summers there, and their houses were made out of wood at this point, all the houses on Main Street caught on fire really quickly, and then the wind blew the fire into the harbor. And the harbor is where they stored all the oil, and also the docks and the ships and the water was covered in whale blubber and oil. So when the fire hit the harbor, everything went up into flames super fast and everything was destroyed. So the islanders focused on rebuilding the houses, mostly out of brick now, because obviously they learned their lesson. But they didn't focus on rebuilding ships in the harbor. So they had lost a lot of the equipment they needed to continue the whale industry. And then finally, when the gold rush started happening in California, a lot of people on Nantucket boarded their whaling ships and sailed them around to California in hopes of finding a fortune there. And so the beach in California was known as a whale ship graveyard because the whale ships that they used to get there were just left there, never to be used again. And so basically 70% of Nantucket's population left Nantucket in search of gold in California. And the quote at the bottom is from the book. My thing is blocking it. It says, "On November 16, 1869, Nantucket's last whaling vessel, the Oak, left the harbor, never to return. So this was just basically when the whaling industry on Nantucket was over, and they had to continue to move on as a community to focus on other things.
Hi, I'm Avery, and I'm a senior here at Hope. I'm studying special education with a minor in secondary English. And so today I'll be splitting the race relations portion with my classmate Josh, but I will just begin. So a little bit of the history is that after the Revolutionary War, most African Americans in New England worked as laborers or servants. So there were a few who were self-employed as barbers or carpenters or even blacksmiths, but by the time that Essex sailed in 1819, the New England states had outlawed slavery. That meant that becoming a sailor in the early 19th century meant having an opportunity to earn a fair wage. And this was a big deal. The Quakers were a religious group that opposed slavery, and since the owners of Nantucket whale ship were often Quakers, they had no problem hiring free Black men or even escaped slaves. So while joining the Essex would seem like a great opportunity, minority groups, we will learn, are not treated equally as whites, which led to great trouble on the Essex. African American sailors on the Essex were, again, not treated fairly in comparison to other Nantucketers. While they were paid the same as white sailors, they were still treated unfairly. We see this within the book, where sailors have to eat and where our African American sailors have to eat and sleep together in the forecastle in a really cramped, extremely cramped and towards the forward part of the vessel. And while our other sailors were able to sleep in a more comfortable situation. The men were also divided among the whaleboats, and the 7 Black sailors with the least experience were put in a whaleboat with the least experienced officer, Matthew Joy. Also, the African American men were the last to be chosen within the whaleboats, and at the end of this, throughout the story, we find out that they were the first to die and the first to be eaten.
Alrighty, so hi everybody. I am Josh. I am a senior special education major with a minor in secondary English. And so I will also be talking about the race relations that we see in the book. And a lot of the times the first interactions that we think of between the Nantucketers and another race is that of the African Americans. But also another one that played a pivotal role was their interactions with the people that were native to the lands that were a part of their lives. So the Wampanoag Native Americans were the people that were native to their area of Nantucket, and for the most part, they coexisted very peacefully. They, although they didn't necessarily intermingle a whole lot, they did have peaceful interactions with one another. And the Wampanoag actually worked alongside the Nantucketers in the whaling industry. On page 26, it says, since the time when the Native Americans had made up the majority of the Nantucket's labor force, the island ship owners had always paid them according to their rank, not their color. Some of this had to do with the Quakers' anti-slavery leanings, but much of it also had to do with the harsh realities of shipboard life. In a tight spot, a captain didn't care if a seaman was white or black. He just wanted to know he could count on the man to complete the appointed task. So just like Avery had mentioned earlier, the African American and Native American sailors were paid an equal wage to those that were white that filled that same position. But the problem was that although this seemed like a fair kind of system, there were limited opportunities for these African American and Native American to rise up in the system, and kind of kept them at that lower level on the totem pole. And then Another group of natives that the Nantucketers interact with are those of the Marquesas Islands. So when the Essex crashes into the whale, they've got a couple different options. So their first option is to sail to the Marquesas Islands, which are about 1,200 miles away and would take about a week or so of traveling to attempt to get to the coast. Their other option is to sail to South America, which is about 2 times the distance, and they're also fighting against the winds and the current, and so their time of travel is really unknown. So it seems pretty obvious, right? Let's go to the shorter, more logical destination. Well, obviously we know that that doesn't happen, or else we wouldn't really have a book to talk about tonight. So we're wondering why did they choose to make this, in hindsight, a logical decision? But the reason behind that is that the Essex men had heard these rumors that the native inhabitants of the Marquesas Islands had this negative reputation for cannibalism. On page 96, it says, "In the times of famine, the men butcher their wives and their children and aged parents, and the men were also remarked for their great size and strength." And I included a picture of the Marquesas natives at this time, and I don't know about you, but these seem like some pretty average guys to me. So it's ultimately what these rumors is what led to the downfall of the sailors. So and also something that also they didn't play into their decision making was that there was a peaceful Christian mission that was located within the Marquesas Islands that most likely would have been a safe haven for these sailors. But due to their lack of research and their reliance on stereotypical rumors, it led to a lot of the sailors losing their lives. And for the ones that did survive, a loss of dignity once they did make it back to Nantucket, for taking part of this taboo practice of cannibalism that they were absolutely terrified of.
Hello, everyone. My name is Caitlin. I am a senior at Hope College studying secondary English education, and I have a minor in psychology. And I'm going to just talk a little bit about some of the major themes and takeaways that we get in the book. So the first theme I'm going to focus on is probably the most obvious, and that is the theme of survival, because the men of the Essex literally do everything they possibly can to survive after the whale has sunk their ship. And so some of the things they end up having to resort to include cannibalism, eating animals that they normally would not have eaten. They talk in the book a little bit about tortoises and other sea creatures that the men were forced to cook and eat and make do with as part of their diet. And they even resort to drinking blood, and that includes the blood of different animals as well as the blood of their dead shipmates. And so throughout the book, if you've read it, you see that we get some modern day research on the psychological and physiological effects of hunger and thirst and why these might have led the men to do some of these things that to us seem unimaginable. And so that kind of contributes to that theme of survival, because we see that they are experiencing these different effects, and it really has an important impact on them during the process of surviving and even after they've been rescued. And so the theme of survival also matters with the location and the impact that it has on Nantucket when they've returned home. It matters who survived and who didn't. We see, I think probably one of the saddest moments is when Captain Pollard has to tell his aunt that he partook in the cooking and eating of her son, his cousin. And so we see like that survival, even after the men have survived, those psychological effects stick with them. And so that kind of brings us into the next theme of morality or humanity. And so it kind of makes us question, what does cannibalism do to humankind? I really hope none of us ever have to resort to this as a practice. That's pretty terrifying to imagine. But it kind of explores the psychological effects it has on the men, and like some of my classmates have been saying, as well as how it affected their reputation on the island, because prior to their departure, cannibalism was really only seen as a foreign practice done by natives who they looked down upon. And so to return to the island and have to admit to participating in this practice made a lot of people on the island question if the men on the Essex had given up parts of their morality or their humanity. And this also is important because Nantucket at the time was prominently dominated by Quakerism. And so we talk a lot in the book about Quakers and the fact that they were pacifists. And yet when these men who participated in Quakerism got on the Essex and got out on these whaling expeditions, they talked about how it was sort of a Jekyll and Hyde effect, and how the men would resort to saying things to their fellow shipmates and doing things that on the island would be deemed unacceptable, but because it was all in the name of whaling, it was celebrated and considered an important aspect of their leadership skills. So that again is a shift that is dependent on location. And so it's sort of, this book makes us question, did the men on the Essex lose their humanity? Do we think that they did? Do we think that they didn't? It really comes down to the fact that we can't really speak to it because we've never been put in this kind of situation. And I don't really know what the answer to that question is. I don't think they would have said that they did necessarily, but I think if you asked a lot of their fellow islanders on Nantucket, they would probably say the opposite. And then two other important themes that we see functioning in the book. The first is community. Nantucket is a very close-knit community. They've got pretty strict hierarchies and structures, even going so far as to like where you live on the island is determined by how high up you are on the whaling food chain. So captains of ships got the best houses in the best locations. They were the most respected members of the community. Your entire status essentially was dependent on how much you contributed to the whaling industry. And they were also very wary of outsiders. And we see this kind of, again, back to what Josh was talking about with race relations. This was part of why they refused to go to islands that were closer and that essentially could have saved them much earlier and led to significantly less of the men passing away. But they were very wary of outsiders. Even when people came from the mainland to the island to participate in their society, they were treated pretty disrespectfully. We also see a community, sort of a brotherhood coming together on the ship Essex, especially after they've been sunk, because in that time, all you have is to stick together and lean on each other in such a traumatic situation. So we see the men sort of growing together despite their differences, and they're growing together spiritually. They talked about how some of the men would lead them in prayers. They're growing together physically because they're having to fight off the effects of dehydration and starvation together. They're also growing together mentally, especially towards the end. We see Owen Chase, who's the first mate, really steps up. And he tries to encourage the men on his whaleboat in particular to keep going and keep surviving, especially when we see some suicidal thoughts happening. And it almost becomes like a family dynamic, which is why they resort to drawing lots to decide who is going to be eaten. And you can just tell from the language in the book that it's a torturous decision for them all to have to resort to this, but they know it's what they need to do to survive. It's also so hard for them to leave people behind. They leave 3 people behind on, I think it's Henderson Island, and there's a lot of tears and a very emotional response to the fracturing of that family dynamic. And Matthew Joy, who's the second mate, he's a Nantucketer. He even displays this familial connection to the other men when he is asked to be moved back to his original whaleboat, which is primarily African-American sailors, and so men that he would not have normally identified with, but he feels a sense of community with them, and so he asks to be moved back to their boat as he's drawing his last breath and he's dying in the whaleboat. And the final theme I'm going to address is the theme of pride. The Nantucketers are very prideful. They stick together. They feel very superior to other people that are not island natives. And a lot of that pride also transfers into the fact that it's very important for the men to have high ranks on ships. So we sort of see this pride coming to a head-to-head sort of situation with Captain Pollard and the first mate, Owen Chase, when they disagree on things, because Pollard's trying to keep his pride as captain, but Chase feels that he knows more about whaling and about what they should be doing than Pollard. So we see sort of that pride of each of them causing conflict. And there's also pride in rank advancement. So it's very important to the men what their official title is on the boat. And so we see this especially with Benjamin Lawrence. He was the next in command of Chase's whale boat, and he wasn't performing his duties to Chase's satisfaction. And so Chase sort of kicked him out of his job and took it over himself. And so we see later in the book, he's really trying to savor his pride and save face aboard the boat by doing whatever he can, volunteering for whatever tasks he can to make himself look good to his fellow sailors. And so those are all of the themes I was going to touch on. I think that is everything for our class's presentation. So I'm going to stop screen sharing, and then we're going to move into some group discussion.
All right, thank you. Can you guys hear me okay? Yeah, people out there? Okay. Thank you, students. That was really well done. I appreciate that. So good job on that. Okay, so now the plan is to, we're gonna kind of go in the same order, and each of us is gonna kind of do a round of one question each, and if there's more time, we'll do it. We've got all kinds of questions to ask, but we'll kind of each do one at a time and open it up for anyone who would like to join the discussion. So I'm gonna ask the first question, and I'm actually gonna answer my question because my answer is like awesome. So I'm just gonna go ahead and do that. Okay, so the first question I have, which I think is a really good question to ask when you read a book together, and that is very simply, did you enjoy reading this book or not? So what was a highlight in the book? Or maybe if you didn't like it, what was a low light? So my answer is I really enjoyed this book, and one of the aspects that I thought was amazing that was very apparent when reading it is that these folks worked, these whalers worked really hard. The work was amazingly difficult. Now, forget the morality of whether they should be out killing hundreds of thousands of whales, and forget the morality of environmental issues and overfishing the sea and all those kinds of things. The fact that they chased these whales, they got in whale boats, they harpooned them, and I always thought a harpoon killed a whale, but a harpoon just kind of hooked the whale, and then they had all kinds of fancy tools to do all the nasty stuff. And then they brought the whales back and they cut them up and boiled the blubber and put the blubber into barrels. And they talked about there were 268 gallons of whale oil in one barrel. And these boats had up to 2,000 barrels of the oil that they would take. That's why it took 2.5 years, 2 years, 3 years to get back. And one of the things that the book said was that this is what I'm kind of building up to, is that if you took a 4-foot square, I don't know what you call a piece of blubber, a hunk of blubber, it was about 8 inches thick, and that one piece weighed 400 pounds. Now, I don't know about you guys, but slinging around 400-pound hunks of blubber would be really hard work. So I guess I was, again, forget the morality. I just thought it was tough work that these folks did to make the living that they made as whalers. Okay, so now we're going to open that. If anyone else, not everyone has to say anything, but if anyone wants to say anything about something they liked about the book, what was a highlight for anybody who wants to join the discussion? You can do that.
I really like the technical aspects of it, learning about how a whale is cut, what you were just talking about, how much oil it was, how big the boats were, all the different, and the diagrams. It was fascinating to me. I'm an engineer, and so I just like that part of the kind of the science behind whaling.
For me, with the book, I just love that when he brought up anything, he included so much other history and so much other background and so much other, that he didn't leave any question unanswered. And, for being such a history buff, he just covered so much and the amount of space that he took to write that story. And I'll admit, I've never read Moby Dick, so this is kind of my first introduction to this story. I was honestly unfamiliar with it. So I thoroughly enjoyed it for that reason, just because it was this great piece of history that I was unfamiliar with. And I just went through it so fast. And I love that he was just so thorough.
I found it very helpful to watch the movie. And that really made real to me all the complexities involved in handling a ship of that nature.
Irv, you got to back up from your camera or something. Yeah, I kept thinking about how young most of them were. I mean, you'd have to be young and strong to do that work, but to just set off across the ocean in, you know, of what seems like a somewhat insubstantial craft compared to what we have today was just daunting.
And to be away from your family for that long, the idea that you come back and your children have grown 3 years.
Right.
My son and I are away from each other for a week, and that's about my limit. Like, I need my boy back. I don't know how they do it as a family.
Okay, thank you. Morgan, you go ahead and ask your first question.
All right, so the next question we're going to discuss is, so during the book, after the disaster, the men are on these separate whaleboats for quite a while, just floating in the open ocean. And in the book, Owen Chase ends up turning to like writing down like a type of journaling, and then a couple men turn to like sort of like religion and like worship. And so I was kind of wondering, what would you guys do or think about just to pass those like endless hours just sitting on like the whale ship? What would you use to help you stay sane?
I would really hope I could have packed a bunch of books.
Well, he seemed to keep busy writing all the time.
Writing, yeah.
I think at one point, didn't they start singing, or the African American led them
Yeah.
in singing? And I'm sure that lifted spirits.
I want to say too that one of the things that I loved as an English teacher is the idea that Chase was haunted by dreams, right, for a while when he was first on the whaleboat. And then when he started journaling, that kind of helped him kind of center himself. So as an English teacher, the idea of journaling, keeping a journal, writing, kind of working things out in your writing is just it's just a wonderful thing, right? A nice selling point to students to say, you know, writing can help you sort things out and maybe center your life a little bit. And it certainly worked for Chase when he was on the boat and having nightmares and so on. He didn't have any more of those after he started writing down some of his thoughts about the adventure.
I think for me, something that would keep me like sane during those times was like, especially getting to know the people I'm on the ship with, and like even their stories about I know that they kind of talked about their different home lives and stuff like that, but I feel like I can only come up with so many stories for myself. So I'd be way more interested in other people's stories and probably like journaling about their stories rather than my own.
All right, so I'm gonna skip my first question because we kind of talked about that a little bit and move to my second. So my question is, how did you feel about the dichotomy or the differences between the Nantucketers' Quaker religion, which was pacifist, and their whaling occupation, which we know to be very violent and gruesome? Discuss how we see these two sides of the Nantucket people causing tensions within the book.
I know. Go ahead, Ann.
No, go ahead, because I was going to ask something about the Quakers, but it wasn't exactly her question, so go ahead.
I was going to say that it's interesting that sometimes we think that it's recent years that we've been kind of nasty to the environment. But you go back to this, I mean, you know, this is the early 1800s, and whale hunting was before that. And, you know, we as a being, you know, humankind has not been wonderful to the environment for for a long, long time. And this is one, it's so interesting to think that even in the early 1800s, these people on Nantucket had to sail all the way to the Pacific Ocean to look for whales because they had fished out the, you know, where they were in the Atlantic. I mean, it seems, you'd think, well, gee, that was probably a 1950s problem or 1960s or something, but we're talking about early 1800s. And, you know, the non-respect for environment has been going for a long time. And that said, did they even realize that they were hurting the environment, or was this just a, you know, it's like, this is what we do, this is our livelihood, this is how we get our energy, this is, you know, is it like the oil industry and the fracking industry and so on now that, you know, that's how we light our homes? And so it was, they saw it as a necessity rather than as a, you know, that they probably thought the whale population would never end. Maybe like we have thought at times that the oil will never end, right? Oil and coal. So I just thought it was interesting, at least for me, maybe a narrow-minded view that environmental abuse is fairly recent, but it's really been going on for a long, long time.
My family was in the lumbering industry in the Upper Peninsula, my grandfather, and they just, you know, just marched through the lumber from east to west, and people needed homes in the West, and so there was a market, and people needed jobs in the Upper Peninsula, and so they thought some, I think, about replacing trees, but not nearly to the extent that they took them down.
Well, and honestly, these conversations haven't ended. I mean, even in the Upper Peninsula, you know, there's still discussions about how much iron ore do we take? Do we reopen the mines? You know, and so it makes you wonder if we've learned from our history at all.
My question before, and if this is something somebody else was going to bring up, let me know, but I thought about the Quakers and the relationship with the African Americans because that seemed incongruous. Were the owners of the ships Quakers or the captains, or who decided how African Americans would be treated on the ship, on the ships?
I think from the book, we do know that most of the people on Nantucket were Quakers. That was their main religion. So I think it can be assumed that the owners of the ships and the captains were Quakers as well. We know for sure that the people on the Essex were Quakers, for sure. Because Nickerson's account talks about how Owen Chase was usually a pretty level-headed person because of his religion when he was on the island, but when he got on the boat, he kind of like exploded into this like crazy hostile person that just wasn't very nice and was really hard-headed, which I always found really very interesting, how like these men had just like dual personalities. They were very different at home than they were on the boat. But it is interesting that we do know the Quakers to be people that supported rights for African Americans, but that we see the mistreatment of them on the Essex. And I feel like there's some tension there too, because it caused us to question whether they were really faithful to their beliefs based on how we see the African Americans treated on the boat in the book.
And the irony was the African American with the navigation system that saved any of them.
Mm-hmm. Wasn't there a part somewhere that's, you know, mentioned one of the black sailors saying none of the rest of the stuff mattered. He was getting paid the same amount as the white. I mean, that's You know, he knew he was going to be unfairly treated. He's black. But as long as he was getting paid, I think
Now
that's just
that
part of the time.
Now that we kind of got started on our race relations question, I'm going to hit some of those questions. And so, do you think that race played a factor in who lived and in who died on the Essex? And it kind of goes into what we were kind of just talking about a little bit. But if anyone wants to elaborate on that.
I thought it was interesting. Another story that they shared about kind of another negative experience on a whaling ship in the book is about it wasn't another ship that had crashed, but it was one that was low in provisions, and so they were really desperate for anything to eat. And the story goes that they were so desperate that they attacked one of the African American sailors and ate him without even drawing lots or having any kind of like democratic decision about it or anything. So I think that does that may represent maybe that the African American sailors maybe were looked to as a little bit more expendable because they weren't necessarily looked to as valuable or equally as the white sailors.
I also thought that it was interesting that the author, I think, tried to get into some science too of the fact that because the African American sailors ate more poorly than the other folks, that therefore their bodies couldn't hold up as long. And so in essence, they, if that's true, and it sounded scientifically like it was the way he presented it, that that their race did play a factor in their deaths because they just weren't able to survive as long being malnourished because they didn't have as much body fat or nutrition to be able to keep going. And one thing I wondered about, and I believe the author mentioned this too, is did we get the whole story? I mean, none of these African American sailors survived. So there's nobody from their group to give a primary, source story of, yes, this is what happened. It was natural deaths, and then people ate bodies to survive. Was there some kind of, foul play that went on, and they were picked out, but everybody, promised not to share that? I mean, I don't know, and I don't want to make up conspiracy theories. We have enough of that going on these days, but but do we get a straight story? Because we never got to hear from them. None of them got to come back and tell the story to their ancestors, who then passed the story on. That the author could research that. We never got to hear their voice in this.
Now, given the year that it was, we probably wouldn't have heard their voice anyway. I mean, it's, there's so little history. There was so little written. There was so little recorded. There was, yeah. I mean, and they ended up in the boat with the least experienced captain. And I mean, there was a lot of factors in there. I think one of the things I found interesting was that, they mentioned that they were actually happier. They felt that they were happier. They're, being in that little hole or that area, I forget the name of it, by themselves, where they didn't have to walk through the cabins and things like that. Like they had that spot that was to themselves, and they were able to be, themselves, I guess, for a while and be free, maybe.
Alrighty, so another question that that plays off of a little bit of what we're going towards is that earlier I read a quote about how the captains didn't necessarily care about who was on their crew because they really just wanted people that could do the demanding tasks that were required of sailors. So I'm wondering, do we think the whaling industry had any influence on how the Nantucketers interacted with the other races? If this may have contributed to maybe these peaceful interactions with people that they that they encountered just because they had some kind of economic benefit to them.
But weren't they kind of the last people chosen for the ship? It's like, okay, we'll take you because we can't find anybody else. So I don't know, you know, and they were segregated there just like, you know, they have been through history. So it's hard to know what actual kind of relationship they might have had.
I also know when doing my research about the whaling industry, before Nantucketers were sending out big whaling ships with large crews, they were sending out small boats with one Nantucketer, and then their rowing crew would be Wampanoag Indians, which were native to Nantucket. And they used these people because they were free labor, and they didn't have to pay them. And so a relationship that was, it was still peaceful, but before the whaling industry, they weren't using them for labor. And then the whaling industry started and they were using them for unfair labor and not paying them. So I think in answer to that question, yeah, the whaling industry definitely changed the way they interacted with the Indians on Nantucket, because they started using them for unfair treatment and unfair advantage.
One of you listed community, and you were talking about Nantucketers were not welcoming to outsiders, and the wealthier people were in a particular part of town. And I'm thinking about Holland in days past. There's a lot of parallels there.
And you
a lot
also
of
have to.
parallels in just the way like factories are, and you know, you have laborers and you have the upper levels, and you know, there's a lot of parallels to today's life and to the way that, you know, I mean, so many factories are like, we don't care who you are, we just need somebody in here. And then, you know, maybe they're treated okay, maybe they're not. It's you know, it's sort of that whole, how the labor movement has come to be, and the difference in the wage gap is there too.
Well, and they were expected, the green hands too. I mean, they're just expected to get on that boat from the way it read. You know, get on that boat and figure it out. You better be able to keep up. You better be able to do this and just figure it out. There's no training. There's no, you know, and if you can't do it, it was gonna be worse on you.
And the Nantucketers' kind of view of relations with other races. I remember they come from the history of, I thought it was really interesting when I read this book the first time on page 77, where they talk about Columbus coming to the New World. And of course, that's the view that white Western European people had, that this was the New World, right? Well, it wasn't the New World. It was a world that had been there for generations and years, with indigenous people living there and thriving and doing all the things they did. And sure, it was new to white Western European people, but you know, then the Nantucketers kind of take on that same view of the world, that, you know, this is the new world and we own this world and we've taken it over so we can use the people who are here already any way that we want to use them. And of course that, you know, is not a good view of how to do things. Caitlin, you want to do yours?
So that's going to kind of bring us into my question, which is, knowing what we learn in the book about the psychological and the physiological effects of survival, do you think that you would have resorted to cannibalism, drinking blood, any of the things that the men on the Essex had to do to survive? Which I know is a tricky question because it's hard to put us in their shoes, but just wondering what your thoughts were.
I don't know that I can tell. Like, yes, maybe. I think it would really depend. You know, yeah.
Well, even they didn't resort to that right off the bat. I mean, the first who died was given a proper burial at sea. I mean, it took them a few people dying, I think, didn't it, before they resorted to cannibalism? I think, when it came to the tortoises, the tortoises were planned. They grabbed all those tortoises while they were still afloat, and, drinking the blood, that might be one thing because it's, the protein and the iron, but, beyond that, I mean, because they it wasn't their first thought. I mean, they started burying people at sea the right way, or, the proper way, before they resorted to that. I don't think it's a question you really can answer until you're in that situation.
You also have to think, I'm guessing that none of us have ever been that hungry. I mean, you've never reached that extreme of, what's it like not to eat for days and weeks on end, or eating just a little bit of that hardtack, kind of dried up, floury, kind of rock hard bread stuff. And then saying, you really could maybe eat anything. I don't know. I've never been there, but we got to remember that it's not just a hunger like, gee, I haven't eaten in 4 hours. It's it's I haven't eaten in 4 weeks, except for a little bit of stuff here and there, right? I'm going to add one more thing. Sorry, I've talked too much, but one thing that I would have done to maybe avoid this hunger thing or make it a little different is I would have told them, dudes, just leave me on Henderson Island with those other 3 guys, because I've had enough of this ocean, man. I'll take my chances here. And if I die in the sand, at least I'm in the sand and I'm not going to drown and freeze and all that other stuff. So, I'm a wuss, but that's probably what I would have done. Now, fortunately, it worked out. Those 3 guys were saved too, weren't they? I mean, someone came back and they were good on their word to say, we'll send somebody back or let somebody know who's going to be by there to help you out. So they were saved. So it actually worked out kind of barely, but it worked out to be a good decision for the 3 to stay there.
I agree with that. I think I would have stayed.
Does anybody have maybe one question we all got to ask a question. It's a couple minutes before jammy time. So I'm just wondering, does anybody have maybe one more question that they want to ask that we could talk about just for a couple minutes, and then we'll call it an evening? So anyone have a question from our audience?
I don't have a question, but I really wanted to thank all of you students and Bill for giving us that kind of background and ways to think about the book. We really appreciate it.
Am I muted or unmuted? Can you hear me now?
Yeah.
I get confused when I see mute and unmute so many times. I forget which one it means. So I guess you can hear me, right? Well, we want to thank you for allowing us to be part of your Friday night. And this has just been fun for us from the beginning of our semester to know that this was going to be something that we would work on together and read the book together and talk about it and come up with kind of a plan. And the students did all of that. Their presentations, came up with the whole thing and put it all on one PowerPoint, and just did a great job. So I appreciate them as you do. So thank you for allowing us to be part of your evening tonight. And we hope that you have a good evening. So thanks, Ann, and hopefully we can do this again next year.
Yeah, thank you, Bill.
You bet.
Thanks for all you did.
Thank you, guys.
Bye.
Take care, everybody.
Bye-bye.
Bye, everyone. Thank you.
Bye. Deb, thanks for arranging to have Bill and the students again. That was great.
Oh, well, Bill's he does amazing things with his students. He just runs with it.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you.
Thank you, guys. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you very much.